Karen, a middle-aged woman accustomed to being judgmental, verbally abused, and falsely reported a homeless veteran in the park. As a result, she was bombarded with accusations and condemnations. She lost her job and was thoroughly humiliated. However, what happened next led her life in a completely different direction. Hey everyone, welcome to Worldly Whispers. Let's get started. On an ordinary morning, Karen Whitfield, a 45-year-old woman accustomed to privilege, walked with purpose through Oakwood Park. Her blonde hair was immaculately styled, and her makeup was applied with precision. Dressed in high-end designer clothes that accentuated her status, she carried herself as if she owned the place. In her view, Oakwood Park was her private haven, a slice of tranquility in the midst of the suburban chaos. As she rounded a familiar bend, her eyes landed on her favorite bench by the duck pond. To her horror, a man was lying there, fast asleep. His face, partially hidden by a tattered baseball cap, was weather-beaten, and his clothes were threadbare and dirty. Instantly, Karen's expression soured. The fact that the man was black and homeless immediately grated on her. In her mind, he had no right to be in her park, let alone on her bench. Karen marched up to the bench and said in a sharp, disdainful tone, "Excuse me, you can't sleep here. This is a park for decent, respectable people, not a flop house." The man, John Williams, slowly stirred from his slumber. Rubbing his eyes, he looked up at Karen with a weary expression. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said in a soft, gravelly voice. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I'll move along." But Karen was far from satisfied. The sight of John, so clearly down on his luck, dredged up memories of her own past struggles. Instead of empathy, it kindled a fierce anger within her. "You should have thought about that before you decided to come here," she snapped. "People like you are ruining this neighborhood. You're making it unsafe for the rest of us." John, who had heard such remarks countless times before, simply lowered his head and began to gather his meager possessions. Not content with just shooing him away, Karen decided to take more drastic measures. She whipped out her phone and dialed 911. "Hello, I need to report a suspicious person in Oakwood Park," she said, her voice quivering with feigned fear. "There's a homeless man here, and he's acting very aggressively. I'm really scared. Please send the police right away." As she spoke, she failed to notice the disapproving looks from other park goers. An elderly man feeding the ducks shook his head in disappointment, and a young mother pushing a stroller gave Karen a disapproving glare. John, a 58-year-old veteran who had served 23 years in the Marines, listened to Karen's false report with resignation. After returning from his military service, he had been plagued by PTSD and a series of misfortunes that had left him homeless. He was all too familiar with the unfair treatment and prejudice that often came his way. Moments later, the sound of sirens filled the air. Two police cruisers pulled up at the park entrance. Karen's face lit up with a sense of self-righteousness. She adjusted her designer jacket and put on a look of distress, ready to play the role of the victim. Officer Michael Rodriguez, the first to approach, had over 15 years of experience on the force. He immediately sensed that something was amiss with Karen's story. "Good morning, ma'am," Officer Rodriguez said, his tone professional yet cautious. "I understand you reported a suspicious person." Karen launched into her fabricated tale, her voice shaking with false emotion. "Yes, officer. I asked him to leave, and he got really angry. He was shouting and acting threateningly. I was so afraid for my life." Officer Rodriguez then turned his attention to John, who was sitting quietly on the bench, his hands visible and his demeanor calm. There was a certain dignity in John's bearing, despite his ragged appearance, that caught the officer's attention. "Sir, could you tell me your name?" Officer Rodriguez asked, his tone softer when addressing John. "John Williams, sir," John replied, his voice steady. "I'm sorry if I caused any trouble. I was just sleeping." As John spoke, Officer Rodriguez noticed a certain hesitation and a familiar set to his shoulders. "Mr. Williams, did you serve in the military?" he inquired. John's eyes met the officer's, a hint of surprise in them. "Yes, sir. 23 years in the Marines." Officer Rodriguez nodded in understanding. "Thank you for your service. I served in the Army, 2 tours in Afghanistan." Karen, who had been watching this exchange with growing impatience, interrupted. "Excuse me, but what does this have to do with anything? This man is trespassing and being a menace. I want him out of the park right now." Officer Rodriguez turned back to Karen, his expression becoming a bit more serious. "Ma'am, being homeless is not a crime. Mr. Williams has as much right to be in this public park as anyone else. There's no evidence that he has been aggressive." Karen's face flushed with anger. She pulled out her phone again and started recording. "This is unacceptable. I'm a taxpayer, and I have the right to feel safe. I'm going to report this to your superiors." As Karen's voice grew louder, attracting more attention from the park goers, Officer Sarah Thompson stepped in. "Ma'am, please calm down. We're just doing our job and assessing the situation." Meanwhile, Officer Rodriguez had moved closer to John and was speaking to him in a low voice. "Mr. Williams, have you been in touch with the VA? There are programs available to help veterans in need, especially for housing." John sighed wearily. "I've tried, sir, but the waiting lists are long, and the paperwork is overwhelming, especially with my PTSD acting up." Officer Rodriguez took pity on him and handed him a card. "Here, this is the contact of a guy at the local veteran center. His name is Dave Martinez. He's good at cutting through red tape. Give him a call and mention my name." Karen, seeing this interaction, became even more enraged. She stormed over to them, still recording. "This is a travesty. You're supposed to be protecting us, not coddling vagrants. I'll make sure everyone knows about this." Officer Thompson tried to intervene, but Karen was beyond reason. She unleashed a torrent of hateful words, her face contorted with anger. Some of the bystanders, appalled by her behavior, started recording her on their phones. Finally, Officer Rodriguez turned to Karen and said firmly, "Ma'am, you called us here under false pretenses. Making false reports to the police is a serious offense. I'm asking you to stop this now." Karen, realizing that she was not getting her way, glared at everyone and then stormed off, vowing to share her version of the story on social media. That evening, Karen sat at her kitchen table, a glass of wine in hand, typing a furious post on Facebook. She described John as a dangerous vagrant, and the police as incompetent for not taking her side. She attached the video she had recorded, carefully editing it to support her narrative. She was confident that once she shared her story, the community would rally behind her. However, she was in for a rude awakening. Within hours, her post went viral, but not in the way she had expected. Other videos from bystanders, showing the full truth of the situation, began to surface. People were shocked by Karen's behavior. Her Facebook page was flooded with angry comments, and many of her so-called friends distanced themselves from her. Karen, who had always seen herself as a pillar of the community, now found herself facing the harsh consequences of her actions and the public's condemnation. The day after the park incident, Karen woke to a social media storm. Her phone was flooded with notifications. The local news had covered the story, and her face was all over, with headlines denouncing her actions. She logged into Facebook, expecting support, but instead, her page was filled with angry comments. Friends she'd known for years criticized her racism and unfriended her publicly. The reality of her situation hit hard as she realized the extent of the backlash. Before she could fully process it, her boss called, summoning her to the office. The drive there was filled with dread. At work, colleagues stared and whispered. In her boss's office, she was fired. "Karen, your actions go against our company's inclusive values. We have to let you go," her boss said. Karen left in a daze, carrying a box of her belongings. In a single day, her job, reputation, and social standing were in ruins. Meanwhile, John's fortune was turning around. He called the number Officer Rodriguez gave him. Dave Martinez at the Veterans Center answered warmly. "John Williams? Mike told me about you. Let's help you get back on track," Dave said. Dave guided John through housing assistance paperwork, explaining the complex forms. He then connected John with a PTSD support group. Initially hesitant, John soon found comfort sharing his experiences with fellow veterans. Dave also secured John a spot in a job training program. "This will give you the skills to re-enter the workforce," Dave told him. For the first time in years, John felt hope. A week later, Karen, still reeling from her losses, found herself at Oakwood Park. Approaching the entrance, she hesitated. This was the place that had brought her so much shame, but she pushed herself to enter. The park was quiet in the late afternoon light. As she walked, she neared the bench where she'd first confronted John. To her surprise, he was there. Karen's heart raced. Her first instinct was to flee, but she forced herself to approach. "Excuse me, Mr. Williams," she said softly. John looked up, tensing at the sight of her. "I owe you an apology. What I did was inexcusable," Karen said, her voice trembling. John regarded her silently for a long moment. "Why are you here? Because you're sorry or because your life's a mess?" he asked. Karen flinched but admitted, "Both. My life's fallen apart, and it made me see how wrong I was. I judged others, thinking I was better, but I've lost everything. I know words don't fix it, but I needed to say I'm sorry." John listened as Karen poured out her feelings. When she finished, he said, "I appreciate the apology, but actions matter more." Karen nodded, understanding she couldn't expect forgiveness easily. As she stood to leave, John added, "I can't forgive you yet, but I believe in second chances. Your coming here to apologize counts for something." Karen felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you, Mr. Williams. I'll do better," she said. As Karen walked away, she felt a mix of shame for her past and determination for the future. This encounter was the start of a new journey for her, one she hoped would lead to redemption and personal growth. It was also a significant moment for John, as he began to see that Karen might be sincere in her desire to change. Their paths, once so divided by prejudice, were now starting to converge in unexpected ways. After her apology to John at the park, Karen was determined to make amends for her past actions. She decided to channel her energy into volunteer work, believing it was a way to give back to the community and also to prove to herself and others that she had changed. She started volunteering at a local soup kitchen, a place that she had previously overlooked, considering it as a place for those people. But now, she saw it as an opportunity to do good. When Karen first arrived at the soup kitchen, she was nervous. She wasn't sure how to interact with the people there, many of whom were in a similar situation to John. However, she was committed to this new path. She began by helping in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, and preparing meals. The work was physically demanding, and the environment was far from the luxurious setting she was accustomed to. But Karen persevered, and as she got more involved, she started to feel a sense of purpose that she had never experienced in her corporate job. One afternoon, as Karen was clearing tables after the lunch rush, she looked up and saw a familiar face entering the soup kitchen. It was John, accompanied by Dave Martinez from the Veterans Center. Karen froze for a moment, unsure of how to react. Dave, who was more perceptive, spotted Karen and waved her over. "Karen, right? I've heard about you. Come meet John properly," he said with a friendly smile. Karen approached nervously, wiping her hands on her apron. "Hello, Mr. Williams. It's good to see you again," she said, her voice a bit hesitant. John nodded, a hint of a smile on his face. "Mrs. Whitfield," he replied. Dave then informed them that John had been making great progress. He was in a transitional housing program, which meant he finally had a stable place to stay, and he was about to start a job training course. "We thought John might want to give back a little too, so we're here to see about volunteer opportunities," Dave explained. Karen's face lit up at the news. "That's wonderful, Mr. Williams. I'm so glad things are looking up for you," she said sincerely. John's expression softened slightly. "Thank you. It's been a long road, but I'm getting there," he replied. As Dave went to speak with the volunteer coordinator, Karen and John found themselves alone. The silence between them was a bit awkward, filled with the weight of their past encounter. Finally, Karen spoke. "Mr. Williams, I know I've said this before, but I truly am sorry for how I treated you. I was wrong, and I'm working every day to be a better person," she said earnestly. John studied her for a moment before responding. "I can see that, Mrs. Whitfield. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong and to try to change. I respect that," he said. Karen felt a weight lift from her shoulders at his words. "Thank you. That means a lot coming from you," she said. At that moment, Dave returned with information about the volunteer work. Karen had an idea. "Mr. Williams, if you're interested, I could show you the ropes here. It can be a bit overwhelming at first, but it's really rewarding work," she offered. John hesitated for a moment. This was the woman who had once called the police on him, but he also saw the change in her. He nodded. "I'd appreciate that, Mrs. Whitfield. Thank you," he said. And so, an unlikely partnership began. Over the next few weeks, Karen and John worked side by side at the soup kitchen. At first, their interactions were stilted. They were both hyper aware of their past conflict. Karen was constantly worried about saying or doing the wrong thing, and John was cautious, still not fully trusting her. But as time went on, they started to find a rhythm in their work. They would work together to serve meals, clean up the kitchen, and even chat with the people who came to the soup kitchen for food. Karen learned more about John's experiences in the military. He told her about the camaraderie he had shared with his fellow soldiers, the sense of purpose he had felt while serving his country, and the difficulties he faced when he returned home with PTSD. John, in turn, saw a different side of Karen. He witnessed her hard work, her willingness to learn, and her genuine desire to help others. One evening, as they were closing up the kitchen, John turned to Karen. "You know, Mrs. Whitfield, when I first met you in that park, I never would have imagined we'd end up here," he said with a chuckle. Karen smiled. "Me neither, Mr. Williams. And please, call me Karen," she said. John returned the smile. "Then I insist you call me John," he said. As they walked out into the cool evening air, Karen felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. She knew she still had a long way to go. One good deed didn't erase a lifetime of prejudice, but she was on the right path. She was building a friendship with John, a friendship that was based on mutual respect and understanding. And for the first time in her life, she felt truly proud of herself. This new friendship was not only changing her, but also giving John a new perspective. It was a reminder that people could change, and that even the most unlikely of relationships could blossom into something beautiful. Their journey together at the soup kitchen was just the beginning of a deeper connection that would continue to grow and strengthen in the days to come. As summer turned to fall, Karen and John's friendship, born from their work at the soup kitchen, kept growing. Karen had found a new, albeit less, prestigious job and was rebuilding her life. John was making great progress in his job training and had moved into more stable housing. One October morning, Karen went to the park for her usual walk. She spotted John sitting on the bench where they first met. He looked distraught, his head in his hands. "John," Karen called, worried. John looked up, and Karen saw tears in his eyes. "Karen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My ex-wife in California has cancer. It's terminal. My daughter called and asked me to come home to help and say goodbye." Karen's heart ached for him. "John, you should go," she said. But John was hesitant. "I can't afford the trip, and I haven't seen them in years, not since I became homeless." Without thinking, Karen said, "We'll figure it out." Over the next few days, Karen helped John. She used her contacts to get him a discounted plane ticket and assisted him in taking a leave from his job training. At the airport, John thanked her. "This is what friends do," Karen replied. After John left, Karen focused on her volunteer work at the soup kitchen, missing their talks. One evening, she overheard two volunteers. That homeless vet scammed a woman, made up a story about a sick ex-wife to get money for a trip to California, one said. Karen was shocked. The details matched John's situation. She tried calling John, but her calls went to voicemail. She reached out to Dave at the Veteran Center, but he hadn't heard from John either. Doubt filled Karen. Had she been fooled? Then, a local news station covered a story about a con man preying on people's guilt. The woman interviewed had a story similar to Karen's. She'd helped a homeless man who then disappeared. Karen, heart broken, decided to call the news station to share what she knew. Just as she was about to call, her phone rang. It was John, calling from a California number. "Karen, I'm sorry I didn't call. Things are complicated. I need your help. Can you come to California?" John said. Karen felt a mix of relief and anger. "John, where have you been? Do you know what's going on here?" John paused, then said, "I can explain everything. Please come." Karen hesitated. Part of her wanted to say no, fearing betrayal. But the part that had changed over the months, the part that trusted their friendship, urged her to go. "Okay, John, I'll come. But you'd better have a good explanation." Karen knew this trip to California was a turning point. It could either prove her newfound trust in John and humanity, right, or confirm her worst fears. This journey would test their friendship and her personal growth to the limit. Karen's heart raced as she boarded the plane to California. Doubt and hope warred within her. The flight seemed endless, each minute stretching as she anxiously awaited answers from John. Finally, the plane landed in Los Angeles. As she made her way through the bustling airport, she spotted John standing near the exit. He looked haggard, his face marked with exhaustion. When their eyes met, a complex mix of emotions passed between them. "John," Karen said, her voice a blend of relief and lingering anger. "Thank you for coming, Karen," John replied, his voice rough. "I know I have a lot to explain." They found a quiet cafe near the airport and sat down. Karen couldn't help but notice how much older John seemed, as if the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. "All right, John," Karen began, her tone firm yet not unkind. "What's going on? Do you have any idea what people are saying back home?" John's shoulders slumped. "I've heard, Karen. I swear to you, none of it is true. My ex-wife's condition was worse than we thought. She had no insurance, and the medical bills were piling up. My daughter, she was so angry and confused when I first got there. She lashed out at me, and I couldn't blame her. I had been gone for so long." He continued, "I wanted to call you to explain, but everything was happening so fast. Then, my phone got stolen at the hospital. I lost all my contacts, and I couldn't remember your number. I was so worried about my ex-wife and trying to make things right with my daughter that I didn't know what to do." As John spoke, Karen felt her anger and doubt slowly ebbing away. She reached across the table and took John's hand. "Oh, John, I'm so sorry you've been through all this alone." Over the next few days, Karen threw herself into helping John. She used her professional skills to organize fundraisers to cover the medical expenses. She negotiated with the hospital, trying to get them to reduce the bills. With her help, John was able to focus on being with his ex-wife and rebuilding his relationship with his daughter. Karen also mediated between John and his daughter, helping them communicate better. One evening, as they sat in the hospital waiting room, John turned to Karen. "You know, a few months ago, I never would have imagined that the woman who called the cops on me in the park would end up being my biggest support," he said with a faint smile. Karen's eyes filled with tears. "John, I can never apologize enough for how I treated you that day. But I'm grateful for the chance to make it right, to be a true friend." As the days passed, John's ex-wife's condition stabilized enough for her to be moved to a hospice. The atmosphere was heavy, but there was also a sense of peace. John and his daughter had started to heal their relationship, thanks in part to Karen's efforts. On their last night in California, Karen and John took a walk along the beach. The sun was setting, painting the sky in beautiful shades of orange and pink. "Karen," John said, stopping to face her, "I don't know how to thank you for everything. You've helped me so much." Karen shook her head. "John, you've given me so much more. You've taught me about resilience, forgiveness, and the power of second chances. Our friendship has changed my life." Back home, Karen and John faced the task of clearing John's name. They reached out to the news station that had run the false story. They provided evidence of John's whereabouts and the real reason for his extended absence. Slowly, the truth began to surface. The woman who had wrongly accused John came forward to apologize. She admitted that she had jumped to conclusions. The news station ran a follow-up story, highlighting John's dedication to his family and Karen's unwavering support. People were touched by their story. Karen and John were invited to speak at community events. They shared their experiences, emphasizing the importance of empathy, forgiveness, and the ability to overcome prejudice. One evening, after a speaking engagement at a local church, an elderly woman approached them. "Your story has given me hope," she said, her eyes filled with tears. "Hope that people can change, that we can overcome our differences." Karen and John looked at each other, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. Their journey, from a bitter confrontation in a park to a strong friendship, had inspired others. In the years that followed, John's ex-wife passed away. Karen stood by John and his daughter during their time of grief. Together, they established a foundation in her memory, dedicated to helping homeless veterans reintegrate into society. Karen continued her journey of personal growth, becoming an advocate for social justice. John, with Karen's encouragement, pursued his dream of becoming a counselor for veterans struggling with PTSD. Their friendship remained a rock in both of their lives. It was a constant reminder of the power of looking beyond first impressions and the importance of giving people second chances. Years later, as they sat on that same park bench where it all began, they reflected on how far they had come. "You know, John," Karen said softly, "I used to think this bench was mine. Now I realize it belongs to everyone. just like the community. We're all in this together. John nodded, his eyes glistening. And that's the most important lesson of all. Their story was a testament to the transformative power of friendship and the possibility of redemption.
If this story touched you, show your support by liking and subscribing. Your encouragement helps us keep sharing memorable stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.